When it comes to camera settings, one of the best known little secrets is a setting called Auto ISO. When this setting is turned on, the camera will automatically adjust the ISO to give you correct exposure, whatever the light conditions. So it's just one other thing you don't have to worry about. Plus it works in all of the various exposure modes, like aperture or shutter speed priority, etc. For example, in aperture priority mode, normally you select the aperture and the ISO, and then the camera figures out the shutter speed. But in auto ISO mode, you would only have to set the aperture, and the camera would choose just not only the shutter speed, but also the ISO. Actually, using auto ISO is a little bit of a contentious issue. Some photographers won't go near it, others love it. So it's down to personal preference. I would say that using it along with aperture or shutter speed priority or program mode is something that's maybe is best suited for beginner photographers. I'll probably start getting hate mail now for saying that, because it is a bit of a sweeping generalisation, and I do know that some professional photographers who do use it all the time, but that's just my opinion. However, auto ISO can also be used with the manual mode, and I believe this is where it's at its most useful. Just imagine if there was an exposure mode that would enable you to set both the aperture and the shutter speed, and then the camera would automatically change a third variable to adjust the exposure. This would be like having simultaneous aperture and shutter speed priority. So combining manual exposure mode with auto ISO can almost be thought of as a kind of third exposure mode alongside aperture and shutter speed priority. Take a look at my film on using manual mode. You'll learn that on its own you have complete control over the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO, but the camera won't compensate for any change in the light. This can be a big problem in rapidly changing conditions, since you may not have enough time to adjust the settings, backwards and forth to compensate. So combining the manual mode with auto ISO does make a lot of sense. Let's see how it works, but before I start I should say that unfortunately ISO is one particular setting that does vary a fair bit from camera to camera, so you'll have to refer to your manual. First, let's look at the mechanics of changing the actual setting on my own Nikon DSLR. To start off with, I'll turn on the auto ISO setting. Now on this particular camera I can specify that I don't want the ISO to exceed a certain value. If you have a newish camera, you can probably set this value to ISO 3200 or even 6400, depending on how averse you are to seeing noise in your images. This particular camera, Nikon D7100, is very good when it comes to noise at higher ISOs, so I'll set it to 6400. If yours is an older model or you hate the thought of any noise in your images, try 800. Having said that, if you have an old model camera, it may not even have auto ISO, as it's quite a new feature. On this camera I can also set the slowest shutter speed that I'm prepared to accept, but that's most useful when using aperture priority mode with auto ISO in order to reduce camera shake or subject movement. It's not really relevant at the moment because I'm going to be using manual mode, and so I'll be setting the aperture and shutter speed myself. On my Nikon V1 mirrorless camera I can also use auto ISO. The settings are slightly different though to my DSLR. For some unknown reason there's no auto ISO 1600, so I'll set it to 3200. Photos from this little camera look fine at ISO 3200, so that's no problem. Notice by the way that it doesn't give me the option of specifying the slowest shutter speed like my DSLR did. Each camera has its own way of doing things. Now that that's set, I've put the camera into manual mode and I'm going to take some pictures of Wilfie in different lighting scenarios. I'm using a Nikon 50mm f1.4 lens. It's a great lens for portraits, and I've set the aperture to f4 and the shutter speed to 500th of a second. That will minimise any camera shake. So we should see how great auto ISO and manual can work together now. So this is quite a dark environment. We've got some overhanging leaves, so this is, to start off with, this is a slightly darker lighting scenario. So let's think. Come back a bit. Looking good. Wilfie's about to give me one of his little cheeky smiles. That looks really nice, and at 500th of a second at f4 the camera's given me ISO 400. We've come out from under the trees, the sun's out, so we'll try another shot. I've still got the shutter speed set to 500th of a second at f4 Well, let's see what the ISO does now. I want to try and backlight Wilfie. You can see the sun is behind him and you've got this lovely light on his hair. The problem is, if I backlight him against the sky, it won't look so good. So I'm going to ask him to crouch down a little bit to get a darker background behind his hair. I'll come around the front here. Oh, that's great. I thought we might as well take a nice photo while we're at it. That looks great. And now the settings are 500th of a second, f4, but this time ISO 100. Oh, and by the way, here's why I didn't want to shoot against the sky. I much prefer to shoot backlit portraits against darker backgrounds to accentuate the lighting on the hair. Plus, the sky tends to go white, which I'm not keen on. Now we're standing inside this old workshop, and although it's a lot darker, we've actually got some really lovely light coming in from an open door, and we should get a completely different type of shot. So let's try again. So Wilfie's got his face turned more towards the open door. That looks really nice. Now for a little smile. One more. We've now got a completely different type of light on Wilfie's face, but it looks great. Aperture f4, 500th of a second, but the ISO has now changed to 1000, and the camera did that on its own. I didn't change any other settings. Going through the images, you can see that the aperture and shutter speed remain the same, but the camera did a good job in changing the ISO to keep a good exposure. So, manual with Auto ISO can be very useful. As I said earlier, you can almost think of it as a third exposure mode. So instead of just setting one of the three variables of the exposure triangle, you can now set two of them. See my other film on the exposure triangle if you're not sure what I mean. Your camera will use the shutter speed and the aperture settings that you selected until the light won't allow those settings to provide an accurate exposure. Only then will the camera change the ISO to keep the same overall exposure. Now, just like any of the semi-auto modes, you may need to use exposure compensation if the photo is too dark or too light. Now, unfortunately, some cameras won't allow you to use exposure compensation when Auto ISO is set on. So check it on your own camera first before you need it. But if the camera does allow it, using exposure compensation on most cameras will increase or lower the ISO and leave the aperture and shutter speed alone. Another thing to be aware of is that on some cameras the Auto ISO setting only increases the ISO upwards from the sensitivity it's set to manually. It sounds a bit complicated, but what I mean is, for example, if your actual ISO is set to say 800, the camera will not use an ISO less than 800. So I would always set the ISO to its lowest value before even starting. Bear in mind that manual and Auto ISO is quite a different mode from full manual. As with Auto ISO, the camera is still using its built-in metering system to determine the correct exposure and to set the ISO, whereas in full manual, you are doing everything. So where might you use these settings? Well, I would say a good time would be when you know the aperture and the shutter speed that you want to use, but when you're trying to shoot maybe quite fast in an environment where the light might be changing. For example, you may be photographing a christening or a wedding inside a church, and then you may have to rush out and go outside, and then the sun keeps going in and out from behind the clouds. That is most annoying, I can tell you. Generally speaking though, it comes down to personal preference. But personally speaking, I probably wouldn't recommend leaving the Auto ISO on for the whole time. Use it only when you really need to get the shot under any circumstances. Having said that, if you're unsure of how to use the ISO setting because you're only maybe just getting started, don't be afraid to experiment with this mode. At the very worst, all you might get are noisier than normal images. Even if you think you might only use it from time to time, do learn how to use it for those occasional times. Experiment, have a play with it. It's fun and it can be useful, and it might just become your favourite exposure mode. Bye for now.